Okay, welcome to Lesson D. We have seen in the past lessons how to manage your media, how to get to a rough cut, how to then refine your rough cut using your editing tools. Now we're going to look at how to add effects to clips. And adding effects and motion graphics to clips is useful and important because it gives us an extra tool to add information to the story that we're presenting. I like to save this for later in the course because I believe that this is sort of frosting on the cake. These are the sort of things that you do once your edit is almost complete, just to enhance the edit. There's one more step beyond that, which is called color correction, which we'll see in a subsequent lesson as well, before finally exporting the video. So this lesson is going to look at motion graphics, titles, and effects to be applied to clips to give a little bit more dynamic motion to your story and add an extra dimension to your editing. So we're going to cover Lesson 9, Lesson 12, Lesson 14, and Lesson 15. And so it's out of order because I believe that these topics belong in this order. It makes more sense from an editor's perspective. So let's begin Lesson D. In your Adobe lessons, I want you to go ahead and open lesson number 9. Okay, my lesson number 9 opens in the Beau's layout, and that is simply because I, in my workspaces, turned off import workspace from projects. We already saw that, so it remembers the last workspace that I was using. So what we have here in project lesson 09, I'm going to drag this over here. I'm going to close all these other panels here simply because I want to focus on the effects control panel. Project lesson number 9 has a few different sequences that all pertain to applying a motion effect to clips. So before we go any further, let's save this one as a work in progress. Work in progress 1, just so we don't copy on top of the original lesson number 9. So we have a sequence open in the timeline, which is, if I scrub through it, is this clip basically zooming in and spinning at the same time. Now the black represents nothing. There's nothing there, and I can show you that if I turn on transparency grid. You can see here's a little checkerboard pattern. There's nothing behind this clip, so that's what that black means. And when you're doing motion graphics, you will be using that transparency grid a lot, especially when you're doing work in the program monitor. It's very helpful to have this transparency grid turned on. For the sake of this particular lesson, I'm going to turn it off, but just keep in mind that you have that option. So this is just a clip simply that has a motion effect applied to it. If I click on this clip and go to Effects Controls, I have 3 tabs in Effects Controls. I'm going to explain a little bit of what's going on here. First, under the Effects Control tab name is to the left, there's a clip called Source Gull MP4. And that is, if I click on that, that is the source clip. You can see this clip is the seagull flying by, and the marked section is highlighted here. If I go Shift O, my cursor goes there. If I go Shift I, my cursor goes to the beginning. And you can see the little hash mark here shows you that I'm at the beginning of the clip. If I go to the end of the clip, I get a hash mark and a purple bar here. So this is the source clip, and it says it right here because I'm looking at the source monitor. If I go back to FX control, look at this side of this little title. It says source Gull MP4. That's the source. If I click here, floating Gull MP4, this is the instance of this clip inside the sequence. This is the name of the sequence, 01 floating. This is the name of the clip, Gull MP4. So these are two different things. The source is the original clip. The instance is the instance of the clip right here in the program monitor or here in the timeline sequence. That's the instance of this clip. One clip can have many instances. We want to select floating Gull MP4, meaning the instance of the Gull MP4 clip inside the floating sequence. Now, if I go a little bit further, there's also a collapsed triangle right here. If I collapse that triangle, it gets rid of all that extra stuff here, and it becomes a sort of semi-transparent or dotted triangle, which is a bit hard to see. So be careful. If you can't see your motion parameters, it could be because this collapsed triangle show hide timeline view has been turned off. So turn it back on. This gives you I'm going to double click on effects controls, make the panel full screen. This gives you a replica of the timeline. So I can grab my playhead, which is right here, and scroll it or scrub it along this timeline. Now note, as I do this, look at what happens in the program monitor. Look at what happens in the timeline. The playhead is the same playhead here, and I'm scrubbing through this instance of the clip in the timeline. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when I can hover over this divider and shrink this a little bit to make the timeline larger. Also, you can use this zoom out device tool here at the bottom to zoom in and zoom out. It has a replica of the timeline ruler up here, 00000200, which replicates this. If I zoom in, if I do a backslash, you can see at 0001, I'm at 0001 here, I'm at 001 here. So this timeline is useful because, as you see, there's little dots here in this timeline. And these dots are on the motion row. Now, there's 3 rows here: motion, opacity, and time remapping. These effects, because these are effects, that's what this little symbol here stands for, FX, are what is called fixed effects or default effects. In other words, they are applied to every single clip by default. And they are also initialized to the default position, unless we introduce what is called a keyframe. To do that, you need to collapse this motion tab, and now you have all the parameters of your motion effect: position, scale, rotation, anchor point, anti-flicker filter. And each one of these also has a collapse triangle, which allows you to enter even more information. We'll see that in a second. Now, opacity also has a collapse triangle, so is time remapping. If I do Alt collapse triangle, they all open up. So Alt collapse triangle is a good way to open up all the parameters or close them all at once. See, when I went into, let's do this again. I'll close FX motion. Let's just only let's double click on the effects control. FX motion, all my parameters are collapsed. If I hit Alt uncollapse, now I have all my parameters opened up with all the extra information that I can work on here. So if I Alt click on this, they all close. Or you can just open one of them at a time. All right, I'm going to collapse this again. So what I'm looking at here is keyframes. That's what these little marks are in this timeline. So this timeline extends all the way down, and each one of these effects has its own row. Now, you can see right here, there's a little stopwatch. That's a stopwatch icon. And this stopwatch icon turns on your animation using keyframes. So, for example, the anchor point is not turned on because there's no anchor point animation, or there's no anti-flicker animation either. But the position one is turned on. If I collapse this, you'll see there's one keyframe here, and I can select it by clicking on it. If I right-click on it, it also gives me the option to, let's see, make sure I right-click on the right thing, to clear it and to add what's called interpolation to that particular keyframe. We're not going to do that right now, but I can also copy it or cut it. Right here are some numbers. These numbers correspond to the position of your clip. So 69, 360 corresponds to this position because that's where my playhead is. And as I scrub my playhead, you can see the position changes until it gets to this position, which is 640 by 360. Now note, 640 by 360 matches the anchor point, 640 by 360. Okay? And if I highlight anchor point, there it shows my anchor point. And if I scrub the animation, you can see that my anchor point is following this dotted line in the program monitor. This is called a rubber band motion animation line. It's also sometimes called a Bezier curve, but we call it a rubber band, and that's because you can grab it and move it like this. That's why we call it a rubber band. I'm going to undo that, but you can see this motion follows that dotted line. That dotted line is the animation. So what is animating is the position of the clip. Now, as the position, which we've changed up here with these keyframes, is changing, the anchor point follows this dotted line. But because we have not introduced any anchor point animation, the anchor point is just in a straight line. If I put my playhead here and change this position, you see the anchor point follows this different line. That's because I introduced a new keyframe here that I highlight here in the position row. So I'm going to do that again. Keyframes are what allow you to animate an effect. Keyframes refers to a traditional animation technique where the lead artist would draw, for example, for Mickey Mouse cartoons, the master drawing, and he would draw the master pose of an animated sequence. And that would be called the keyframe. Then he would draw the next master pose, and that would be called the next keyframe. And the in-between artists would draw all the stops in between those two key master poses. And with digital computer animation now, what we are able to do is to select a keyframe, tell it where we want our first keyframe to be, select another keyframe. Now I can navigate between my two keyframes with these arrows here. Now be careful, sometimes you might click on the number instead of clicking on the arrow. But this goes to next keyframe, which is this one. This goes to previous keyframe, which is this one. Notice that next to that there's a little reset parameter. If I hit reset parameter, what it did was reset that keyframe to 640 by 360, which puts the clip in the middle. But notice the clip is still spinning. Why is that? Well, that's because I also have a scale animation going on. Remember, if you want to see what is animated, look at the little stopwatches. There's a scale animation going on, and there's a rotation animation going on. The scale goes from 16 to 100. So if I jump back to this previous keyframe, I can make it larger by, you see this little scrub arrow that comes up? I can scrub it or shrink it. I can make it come up from 0. And now the frame comes up from 0. Now if I go into my timeline and hit home and spacebar, there's the animation. Comes up from 0. Let's put it back to 16. So how do I do that? I can click on this number, type 16, hit enter. And now it's back at 16. You can see the rotation starts at 90 degrees. And if I jump to this keyframe, it's at 0 degrees. Now notice there's another keyframe too over here. Now why is that? Well, that's because we want the rotation animation to stop before the zoom animation. You see the zoom animation continues, but the frame is in its final position rotation-wise. So that is because we put a keyframe here before the final position keyframe. Now, I could take this keyframe and move it here. So now the rotation would happen quicker, and then the zoom would happen. So that is keyframes in a nutshell. Keyframes allow you to animate an applied effect. The motion, opacity, and time remapping effects are called fixed effects or default effects because they are always, every clip has these applied to them. Now, they're not animated, nor are they altered. They're set to default unless you come in here and start to lay in animation keyframes. Now, for example, I can animate the anchor point. Now, I explained anchor points in an earlier lesson. The anchor point is this dot here in the middle. The anchor point is not animated right now because if you look on the anchor point row, there are no keyframes. But let's go ahead and turn on the anchor point stopwatch. It immediately inserted a keyframe. I'm going to also uncollapse this. It immediately inserted a keyframe at this key frame, which is frame 3 seconds and 10 frames. That's the frame. This is where that key frame has been set. The anchor point, notice the anchor point's in the center of your screen, so it's 640 by 360. That's exactly the center of your screen right here. Remember, this sequence, the center of this screen is going to be, if I go to sequence settings, 1280 by 720, so it's going to be half of 1280, which is 640, and half of 720, which is 360. So this is 640 by 360. That's right there. Now, if I took this anchor point and dragged it up here and put it right there, for example, watch the difference in my animation. Look what happens to the zoom after the anchor point. It pushes this clip off the screen. That's because now I have an anchor point animation. And now look at my straight line is here instead of used to be here. Remember, now it's up here because my anchor point starts here and goes there. So I still have the same rotation effect. I still have the same zoom effect, but instead it pushes it off the screen like this. So we have this little animation that we created with keyframes, and we're animating the position, the scale, the rotation, and now also the anchor point. Now by introducing this new anchor point position, remember we moved the anchor point to the tip of this clip instead of the center. What it did was alter its path. So now if I go to the last keyframe, the position has been thrown off screen. So I'm going to change that, and I can change that here by hovering over these numbers and dragging them, or simply taking the clip and bringing it back full screen. I could also go 0, 0 for the position, and that would snap the clip full frame. Now, I can only do 0, 0 because my anchor point, actually, I'm going to make sure my anchor point is at 0, 0 as well. 0, 0. So my anchor point is at 0, 0. Now notice I have this little wobble here. That's because there's a extra keyframe that has been introduced here in the position row, and that was introduced when I made my new anchor point. Remember, originally it was here, and so that introduced a new position anchor keyframe as well. Now I could select that keyframe and get rid of it, but what I want to do is I want to take advantage of this. I want to take advantage of what it did here to show you these extra bits of information related to my keyframes. So if I uncollapse the position parameter, what I have here is a graph. And this graph shows the path of the clip with the keyframes. And each keyframe has little blue handles on it that I can alter by dragging one way or the other. Right? And we could try to see what this will look like. I'm sure it'll look a bit strange, but it's probably going to jump. See, if we animate this now, by the way, I can hit spacebar here. See, the clip kind of does a little jog there. It goes up and then comes back down. That's because I animated the position animation, and I altered it by adding what is called a Bezier curve to it. That's what these lines are. I could get rid of them by right-clicking and go temporal interpolation. See how it says Bezier, turn on linear? But there's two interpolations to look out for. Bezier basically was the name of a mathematician, but Bezier, a French mathematician, his name was Bezier. That's you'll hear that term a lot, especially in animation. It has to do with the smoothing of the motion. And these are different ways to smooth out the motion. Right now, auto Bezier is turned on. I'm going to turn that off. Put that back to linear. I'm going to try to put everything on linear. And same with this one. Linear, spatial, linear. Same with the first one. So what that does is that gets rid of any kind of smoothing effects. Now I'm going to delete this keyframe because it's kind of bothering me. And to delete a keyframe, you can just select it, hit clear. That gets rid of the keyframe. I'm going to also delete this one because it's also kind of bothering me. And I'm going to, let's take a look at the animation now. And now the position is going to remain the same. The only thing that's changing is the rotation, and it rotates around this new anchor point, which we set to be here. So you can see the clip rotates, but it doesn't relocate. So I'm going to readjust this position keyframe by dragging it to here, to the upper left-hand corner of my screen. And now when I animate, you see I didn't even have to add another keyframe for it to animate like this, which produces a pretty interesting animation of the clip just flying in from the upper left-hand side. Now notice, if I play it again, you'll see how it turns and then the zoom is kind of smoothed out. So that's a scale, that's the scale, the zoom is a scale animation. And if I right click on this keyframe, notice it has Bezier turned on. That's what that slowing down of the zoom is. It's called an ease in and an ease out. So I'm going to turn this off. Notice my keyframe icon turns back into a diamond shape. And if I play this down, it should be a lot more linear in its motion. Now there's a little bit of a jitter there, and that's simply because the computer is having a hard time playing it back in real time. This shows you one of the things that's going to start to happen once you start to apply effects to your clips. Sometimes the playback's not going to be perfect, and that's why you have this option to put it in half or quarter. I'm going to put it into full, and we'll see what the playback does now. Much smoother. And so you can see now that this motion is very linear. So if I right click on this scale keyframe here and turn continuous Bezier on, for example, and I can uncollapse this scale parameter. See what the continuous Bezier did? There's two things going on here, the scale and the velocity. The velocity was changed, and I can also continue to change this here by stretching these Bezier parameters up or down. Now these are your Bezier curves right here, and you have handles that you can use to alter these curves. Now you're not necessarily going to be doing a lot of that unless you're doing a very specific type of effect. And right now we're only doing motion effects. We're not doing visual effects so much. But let's see what it did to the motion. Basically, the zoom happens a little bit faster at the beginning and slows down. See, this is what this means. Velocity, it's fast at the beginning and then it slows down. Or we could have made it slow at the beginning and then speed it up. And then speed it up at the end. We click on this again, speed it up at the end by doing that. Now, let's play it back. Slow at the beginning, and then it did a little bump thing at the end there. Comes in, and you see how it from here on, it sort of zoomed in a bit faster. This is all very subtle. These are subtle effects. So this takes a little bit getting used to as well. But I need to point it out to you that they're here. If I turn it all back to linear, it's going to get rid of all my Bezier curves. And now it should be just basically the linear motion, continuous linear motion. Let's add another scale keyframe. Now, to add a keyframe, you can either change the parameter that added an automatic keyframe. I'm going to undo that. Or you can press on this button in the middle of this navigation bar here, which will also add a keyframe. And now I can change the parameter of that keyframe. So you see now I have, let's take a look at what this looks like. I have it zooms in all the way and zooms out. But I put my scale at 375, which is zoomed in. So let's just say I want my zoom to be zoomed out all the way. You see how it zooms out and then zooms in. Well, it's a bit sort of not interesting. So let's do this. Let's alter this keyframe and then also alter this keyframe. So I'll now zoom out from this position. So it's going to zoom in and zoom out. So if I do it right now, it's linear, you can see. It's basically all motions are linear. It zooms in and snaps and zooms out. But if I introduce a Bezier here, let's just say continuous Bezier, you see how it's smoothed everything out? Now let's play it back. Go to the beginning, play it back, smooth, and then it goes back. So continuous Bezier is a good bet to get a smooth motion. It smooths it all out by itself. Now, of course, I can alter these and do all kinds of weird things with these if I want to. And for example, let's see what this one looks like. You see how, so now you can really see what messing with those Bezier curves did. The spin happens off screen now. That happens off screen, then it zooms in and snaps back. So that was my Beziers as I messed with them, but I snapped it back to continuous Bezier, which, you know, if you go to audio or continuous Bezier, it will basically smooth out your motion, and typically that's all you need. Now there's one more option here that I want to point out, which is hold. If I click on hold here, now let's watch what happens. It spins, it holds the motion, and then it snaps. Hold, it turns into this kind of strange home plate looking icon. That's a baseball term. It looks like a home plate. And that's because it's going to hold that position all the way till it hits the next keyframe. Hold, 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 hold that position, snap to the other position. So sometimes that's useful. If you want something to hold for a while, you can turn that on. And let's say, okay, then I don't want you to hold anymore. introduce another keyframe that does not have hold turned on, it's going to do this. It'll play, it'll hold, it'll get to the next keyframe, and then zoom back. So that's sometimes useful. With a title, for example, you want a title to fly in, hold, and then fly out. You can do that by turning on hold. Remember as well, if I click on this reset parameter, it'll reset all my keyframes. Any keyframe that my playhead is positioned on, it'll reset it to default. This is how you navigate between keyframes, these arrows here. Or you can scrub the playhead. With snapping turned on, it should snap to your keyframes. So that is keyframing inside the effects control panel. A lot of times you'll want to maximize it just so that you can kind of see what you're doing, especially if you're altering the Bezier curves. So now we saw how to add keyframes here in the effects control panel. Now we're going to take a look at how to add motion effects inside the program monitor. But before we do that, I just want to show you something really quickly that I forgot to show you a minute ago. Let's uncollapse the motion parameter. And I'm going to Alt uncollapse the position parameter to open up all the different Bezier curves. I'm going to double click on effects controls. Now, let's say you're working on a particular Bezier curve. Let's say the rotation one. And for whatever reason, you need to see a little bit of a bigger curve. You can drag the bottom of that row. You can drag it up or down to expand it, to have better access to these motion parameters. Okay, you see how, for example, down here, the velocity one, if I do this, the velocity one gets clipped off there. Well, I can expand it to have a better view of what's happening. So this, anyway, is useful when you're working with your Bezier curves, to be able to know that you can expand each one of these parameters. And of course, you don't have to have them all open at once. You can just expand the one that you're working on to make it simpler. And then you can make that really big so you can like move around and do whatever you need to do. All right, that's one thing. Again, Alt, click, closes them all, opens them all. Same with Alt, click on that. Double click the effects control panel, close that. Another thing you might have noticed is in my timeline, when I hit home and hit spacebar, as it plays the clip, my timeline starts to move forward. But that is because I set, in my timeline preferences, I set timeline playback auto scrolling smooth scroll. And I did that just as a useful tool for me when I was putting together an edit. I wanted the timeline to scroll along with the playhead. That's what that does. If you turn on no scroll, which I'll do right here, hit backslash, put the playhead at the beginning by hitting home, hit spacebar. Now the timeline doesn't move anymore, but the playhead can continue off the screen, which was not what I wanted when I was doing a previous edit. So I'll just leave this on no scroll for now, since we're just dealing with small clips. But if you do see that happening while I'm doing the lesson, that's simply because in my timeline preferences, I set to smooth scroll right here. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead, and in my project lesson, we're going to turn on sequence number 2 motion by double clicking on it, loading it into the timeline. And if I play it down by hitting spacebar, you'll see it's just one shot of this camera, and Notice the playhead just keeps going. Now watch what happens when the playhead goes off the screen. It just keeps going. And I wouldn't even know that unless I took a look at these numbers here and hit spacebar. And now, when I hit spacebar, my playhead's way over here. So that's why I turned on scrolling, because it was getting a little bit distracting. So, and again, there's a lot of tracks here. I don't know why there's so many. I don't quite know why they have 4 audio tracks and 3 video tracks when we're only dealing with 1 clip here. I'm going to right click, delete tracks, delete audio, and delete video, all empty tracks. And then I'm going to shift scroll on this track height just to shrink it a little bit, because I mean, wow, that was taking up a lot of room there for, in my opinion, no good reason. Okay, so now, especially when you're working with effects, you're going to be working up here. You're going to want extra real estate up here. You're not going to want this to take up a lot of room. So really, honestly, I would even probably do this, shrink it like this, because I know that. And frankly, I would even turn off the ruler, just have it like this. I know that this is my timeline. I know everything's down here, but I don't necessarily need to see it. And because I can see it right here. This is my timeline as well. Working with effects, you're going to want to maximize this real estate. Now this is where having an extra monitor can be useful, because you can take this effects control panel, throw it onto a separate monitor, and give yourself all this other real estate to do your editing with. Okay, but in any case, we have this motion, 0-2 motion sequence open in the timeline. I want you to click on the clip in the timeline. That loads up the motion parameters in the effects control window. Remember, the effects control window tells you what you're looking at. Right now, the highlighted clip is 0-2 motion, which is the sequence right here. 718-0009-01B clip, which is this clip, this instance of the clip in the timeline. Over here, if I click on this, this is the source. This is not the clip in the timeline, so be very careful. Select the one in the timeline. And I have my default effects automatically applied to the clip in the timeline. I'm going to go to my program monitor, click on program monitor, and we're going to try to learn how to create motion effects here inside the program monitor, which is useful sometimes because you can actually see the image. But in order to do that, I want to see beyond my edges sometimes. So I'm going to turn this fit down to 50%, so that now I have room around the bounding box, so that in case I move my clip, I can see around the edges of my clip or of my sequence. So this really illustrates how the sequence is a window through which you are viewing your clips. That's a great way to think of the sequence. In other words, your sequence will determine how you are viewing your clips. Your clips can be any frame rate, any codec, any resolution, but your sequence is going to determine the window that you're viewing them through. And motion graphics, motion effects really illustrate that nicely, because now you're applying motion effects to your clip, but the sequence window does not change. All right, so in the program monitor, set zoom level to 50% or even 25%. That's a bit small, so I put it at 50%. Now, if you play the clip, I'm gonna go to my timeline, hit backslash Now if you scrub in your timeline, you can notice that, look, see what it's doing and how it's jittering? That's because I have this turned on to full. I'm going to turn this on to 1/4. That should make it a little bit more smooth. Not a whole lot more smooth. It makes it more blurry, that's for sure. These are all playback issues with your graphics card. My graphics card doesn't happen to be a super advanced graphics card, so it's doing its best. With the program monitor selected, go to the View menu and turn on Snap in Program Monitor. This view menu gives you a couple of things, a couple of options that are very useful. Obviously the playback resolution, which I've turned to 1/4. Maybe if I turn off this high quality playback, it won't jitter so much. Yeah, there you go. You see, now I don't have the jitters anymore because I turned off high quality playback. Now note that right now, if I turn on my view menu, I'm only getting the playback resolution as relative to the timeline. That's because my timeline is selected. So let's reselect the program monitor. And in the program monitor, go to the view menu. And I want to go to show guides, turn that on, and I'm going to turn on show rulers. And look what this does in the program monitor. I'm going to expand my program monitor a little bit. And now my program monitor has rulers, a little ruler grid. And I can also grab, if I click inside this ruler area and pull, I can pull out a little guide. So now I have guides. And if I turn on View, Snap to Program and Program Monitor, then my clip is going to snap to the guide. You see how it's snapping? This is very useful. You can create as many guides as you want. And with the ruler, you can kind of also give yourself some parameters. We're going to drag the clip down and to the right so that it's partially out of the frame, say over here. Let's click it to these guide lines so it snaps to that guideline. Go to the Effects Control Panel and open the Motion tab. You'll see that it's changed the position. And let's go ahead and animate this. I'm going to open this up a little bit. By clicking on the stopwatch, that introduces a keyframe here. Now I'm going to go to the end of my clip. Now there's several different ways to do that. You can drag your playhead like this till it snaps to the end of the clip. But notice I'm on a black frame here. So I'm actually beyond the end of my clip. I'm actually one frame beyond the end of my clip, so I need to do one back arrow. Remember this when you're applying effects. Another way I could do it is to do a down arrow. That again snaps me to the beginning of the next edit. One frame beyond the end of the clip. Do a back arrow, and that's the last frame of my clip. I could do an up arrow, down arrow. See, I'm not even dragging anything right now. Up arrow takes me to the beginning of my clip. Down arrow takes me to beyond the end of my clip. I have to come back one frame. That's the end of my clip. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Motion tab, grab my clip over here by hand, and snap it. You see those little red dotted lines? Snap it to the edge of the sequence. So it created a straight line rubber band here. And I can play it back. Remember, I can click on this arrow, go to endpoint, hit play. This now is what my shot looks like. So now we have this animation of this clip in the program monitor. Now notice my playhead keeps playing in the sequence. That's because there is a clip way down here in the sequence. I don't know why they have put such a big space between the two clips, but I'm going to delete that space. And now I'll do a backslash. And I'm also give these clips a different color because I don't like seeing them. Even brown is better. I don't like not seeing them with that dark gray color. Almost looks like they're not there. And that is a label that I created. If I go here, with my labels, I created a gray label here. So now my clips sometimes are gray. So I changed it to brown, so now you can see them in here. They're probably going to be a different color for you because I changed my preferences. Again, that's preferences, labels, gray, you see right here. That just happens to be a color that I created for my labels. Okay, so working in the Program Monitor allows you to apply motion effects to your clip in the Program Monitor. But you have to click on the Effects tab. For example, the Motion tab really is the only one that you can more or less, really is the only one that you can animate in the Program Monitor. But because it's the one you're mostly going to be using for moving clips, it's useful to work in the Program Monitor like this. Now, if you want to maximize your real estate, you can double click on Program Monitor. And now you can select your keyframes like this. And let's say we don't want it to start off screen like this. We want it to start like this. And now it'll move in like this. So we kind of imitated a sort of a wipe in a way. And also your grids can be very useful and your rulers can be very useful, but note that you can also turn all that off. You can clear your guides. That clears my guides. You can turn off the guides. You can turn off the ruler. And now you can also turn off the Snap and Program Monitor in case you just want to freeform this any way you want. And let's say I'll put it over here like this. Notice my Bezier curve is right there. I can alter my Bezier curve by dragging these handles, remember? And what that's going to do is do a very, very discrete smoothing, but I can also grab them and pull them way off screen like this. And I can also, remember, it's a rubber band. This is a rubber band effect, so I can take this rubber band and I can do anything I want with this rubber band. So let's say I want the clip to go up here and to end down here. Now if I play, it's going to go up, swing around, and come down. Double click on your Program Monitor to close it back up. In my Motion tab, if I open my Motion tab now, I've got all these extra keyframes. If I open my Position tab, I've also got all this Bezier information here. I'll double click on Effects Controls. I can turn on Continuous Bezier, and now I have all this smoothing, which obviously I can alter, etc., etc. We know all that. In my effects control panel, I have 3 keyframes, 1, 2, 3 for my position parameter. Let's jump to the first keyframe. Now, if I'm altering the parameters in the effects control tab, I can obviously move the numbers like this. Let's say I want it to be more up here and more in screen like this. You see, I can just scrub over these numbers. I can also type something, 200. If I want to scrub these numbers faster, I could do Shift Scrub. You see how that goes much faster? So I can put it back in the middle here. If I wanted to go slower, I can go Control Scrub. You see, ooh, that's very slow. That's for very specific settings. Control Scrub. That's very useful. And if I want to reset it, I just hit Reset, and that smacks it right back to the defaults. As long as my anchor point is reset to the default 640 by 360, remember that's half of the sequence size, then my default position is 640 by 360. Note the other keyframes are still in motion, so if I play it down, there still is motion in here. All right, so let's go to the project project window and select sequence number 3, which is called Montage. And I'm going to go ahead and expand this a little bit. In this case, I'm going to shrink these clip sizes. And if I play it back, I go home, playback. You can see it's a little edit. And what we're looking at now is essentially the B-roll of the edit. Now, on top of that B-roll are graphics. And the graphics are actually turned off right now because these 3 tracks have been turned off. So if I turn these 3 tracks on, play it back, you can see there's a tint that's been applied, there's a title that's been applied, and there's a color effect that's been applied with a little bit of a sort of highlight in the center there of the image. We'll turn these back off. Let's select the first video clip on track V3. That's going to be 718. Now let's go into the effects control panel. Notice obviously motion, opacity, time remapping are all there. And notice we're looking at inside the 03 montage sequence, clip 718, etc., etc. Select the timeline real quick, hit home. That's going to put our playhead at the beginning of this clip because it's the first clip in the sequence. And in the position parameter, let's click on the stopwatch. That introduces a keyframe here at the first frame of this clip. Now we're going to actually animate this clip at this position. We're going to enter a position setting of -640. So I'm just going to put a minus in front of it. Hit enter. Now what that did is completely took the clip off the screen to the left. Now we're going to go to the last frame of this clip. So I'm going to turn off the targeting for these 3 tracks because I'm working on track V3 now. And now if I do a down arrow, it's going to take me to the last, actually, the first frame of the following clip, 718. That's not what I want. I want the last frame of this clip, so I have to go back 1 frame. So now I'm at the last frame of the clip 718.80008, and I'm going to change the position to 1920. And notice in my program monitor, now I have a rubber band. And if I make this even smaller, put it to 25, you can see the rubber band stretches from here all the way to there. And if I scrub this, you can see what the clip does. The clip pans in from the left and pans out to the right. So this time I just added keyframes using my effects control panel using numbers. I only changed the x-axis, that's what the first number is. The x-axis is from left to right, the y-axis is from top to bottom. So I only changed the x-axis from left to right. Remember, my keyframes are only at the beginning and end of my clip. See, here's the last frame of the clip. Here's the first frame of the clip. I don't have any Bezier applied. You can see that there. So it's a linear move. We're going to keep it like that. Double click in Effects Controls. So if I go to the sequence, hit H, and I go home and I play this down, you see the clip come over and move out, and then there's a strange cut there where before the camera comes on, there's a clip underneath it. The clip underneath it is this clip, 7180013, because this clip pans out of view, then we see this clip underneath, but then there's a cut to the camera. So what we want to do is we want to apply a motion effect to this clip of the camera as well. What we're going to do is we're going to apply the exact same motion effect, in other words, this pan, to the following two clips in track V3. Now I'm going to just expand this a little bit. So you have these three clips, 1, 2, 3 right here. This is the one we're working on. So in order to do that, you can right click on this clip, go copy. You can select these two other clips holding the shift key. Right click on this clip and go paste attributes. And now you have a paste attributes window that tells you what video attributes you want to paste. The motion, the opacity, and the time remapping. Well, I can leave these turned on because I didn't make any changes to those, so yes. And the motion is the one that I changed, so I want to save that on. Now notice up here there's a option to scale attribute times. I'm going to leave this on here, but basically what this does, it adjusts the timing of your motion effects to the length of the clip that you're applying it to. So if the clip is smaller, it's going to shrink that move to match that smaller clip. So sometimes this is useful. However, sometimes this will introduce a move that you were not planning on. So at times you might want to turn that off. We're going to leave it on right now and hit OK. And now in my timeline, I'm going to hit Home, Playback. You'll see all three clips now have this move applied to them. So that is how you can copy a motion effect from one clip to another. Let's click on the first clip again. Remember, motion, opacity, time remapping are default fixed effects. So every time you click and paste attributes, these will always be there. Underneath you have another box called Effects. There's nothing there because no extra effects have been selected yet. But when we start selecting extra effects, they'll appear here. And the difference is between the fixed effects, motion, opacity, time remapping, and the Other effects, they behave in two different ways. The fixed effects can only be applied once. In other words, whenever you make a change to motion, opacity, or time remapping, that's going to overwrite any of the other changes in motion, opacity, and time remapping. But for the other effects, that's not the case. So if you put on, say, a color effect onto a clip, and you copy it and paste it again, that color effect will be applied twice. Not so with the motion, opacity, and time remapping. They can only be applied once. So that's important to remember. The motion, opacity, time remapping are default fixed effects that are always applied and that can only be applied once. By the way, you can also get rid of effects. Let's select the timeline again. And let's select these two clips that we just applied an effect to. And I'm going to right click. And this time I'm going to go remove attributes. I want to remove the motion. Of course, there's no opacity or time remapping, but I'm going to just leave that on anyway. And hit OK. So now if I play this sequence down, it just cuts to these two shots. Their motion effects have been removed. Let me put this back on 50%. It gives us a little bit more viewing area. All right, there might be an occasion where a clip might be a different size from your sequence settings. And so you will need to adjust either your sequence settings or your clip settings. Typically, you will adjust your clip settings to fit the sequence. So let's go ahead and lesson 9, open sequence number 4. I'm going to play this down real quick. And this first clip we can see is actually kind of zoomed in. And this last clip we can see is even more zoomed in. You can see this clip is cropped obviously inside the sequence. So you can select a clip here, go to your effects control, open your motion tab, and it will show that the scale is at 100. Now you might say, well, at 100 it's too big for this sequence. And if we quickly take a look, I'm going to go ahead and right click on this clip right here. I'm going to go reveal in project. There's the clip, Snow 3. I'm going to look at its metadata right here, video info, Snow 3. It's a 4K clip, 4096 by 2160. And this sequence, if I check the sequence settings, I have to select my sequence. Sequence settings is simply a 1280 by 720. So it's a 720p sequence. So clearly this 4K clip is way too big for the 720p sequence. Well, that's not a bad thing. It's better for it to be too big than too little, to be honest. Because by shrinking this clip, you can make it fit into this sequence. Now you can shrink it by hand here with the scale and just try to approximate it, and looks like it's at about 32%. In reality, it's 33%. Or, I'll go back to 100% here. You could right click on it in the sequence and choose Set to Frame Size. And it'll snap it to the size of the sequence. Notice it's made at 31.3. If I go Fit, you can still see that there's letterboxing here. And that has to do with the proportions of the clip. So this clip is wider than it is tall, so it's not 16 by 9. So you would still have to go in there, and I would say, like I said, put it at 33. so that you're cropping that letterboxing. But by doing a scale or set to frame size, it automatically snaps it to the boundaries of your sequence. So now my clip fits into my sequence. You can see the entire clip, both horizontally and vertically, inside my sequence. But since the proportion doesn't match, we have a little bit of letterboxing here. This is a quick way to get to the correct size in your sequence. Now, of course, I would adjust it like I just did. There's another, I can undo that, or just click here and go back to 100. There's another option which says scale to frame size. Now, I would not recommend using that one, because this one actually re-renders the clip at that particular frame size. It looks like it's doing the same thing, but it's actually not. Because now, if you look in your motion tab, the scale says this clip is now at 100%. So if you want to get rid of that letterboxing, you're actually going to have to make it bigger than 100%, which means actually I'm actually zooming in to 110%, 109%. So those are two different, very different options. One is set to frame size, which just expands the clip to fit. The other one re-renders scale to frame size, re-renders the clip to make this new size be 100%. So I would watch out for that, and I would typically rather just use than the other version, which is set to frame size. And even in this case, you're still going to need to adjust it. So 33% would work well for this case. So we're going to look at another way of animating a clip. Position the playhead at the edit point between the first and the second clip. You can do that with your up and down arrows. Click on the clip in the timeline and turn on the effects control panel in the upper right hand corner. The scale setting is at 100% right here. If we do right click, set to frame size, it'll snap to 33.3%, which means that this has actually shrunk the image to fit into our sequence. Now, as a rule of thumb, it's always better to have to shrink an image rather than to zoom into an image. Zooming in is going to introduce noise. Shrinking will maintain focus and quality. So it's always better to have a clip that's too big for the sequence rather than a clip that's too little for the sequence. And it's important to keep in mind, and we've already spoken about this, the difference between the sizes of clips and the sizes of the sequence. You're going to have to make decisions regarding how to accommodate clips that are too big for certain sequences, or clips that are too little for certain sequences, or sequences that are too little for certain clips, etc., etc. So these are choices that you have to make as an editor. So the main rule of thumb is, if the clip is bigger than the sequence, you're fine. If the clip is smaller than the sequence, well, then you have to be careful when you zoom into it or scale it up. So we scaled to fit, and that zoomed it down to 33%, which is fine. We're at the first frame of the clip. We're going to turn on the scale animation by clicking on the stopwatch. That introduces our first keyframe. Now we're going to position the playhead at the last frame of the clip by doing a down arrow. Remember, what the down arrow does, it puts us at the first frame of the following clip. So I'm going to do one back arrow. Now I'm at the last frame of my clip. And now I'm going to put this back at 100% and hit enter. And if I play this clip back, I've got a zoom effect. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to go to the last frame, and now I can just click on this keyframe navigator to go to my last frame. And I'm going to put this at 33%. And I'm going to come back to my first frame, and I'm going to hit reset. The reset's going to put the first frame back at 100%. And now if I play it down, we have this weird effect where I'm zooming in as I'm zooming out as I'm zooming in. In other words, I'm pulling back as I'm zooming in. This is a well-known effect that is often used, which is called a dolly zoom or a push zoom, which is combining, it looks like you're distorting the image, which you are in fact, because you're pushing. The original image is a drone shot moving forward. But as you zoom out, you're going against that motion. So what we get is this strange push zoom effect. So we'll leave that. That's pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead and select my timeline. And in my timeline, I have one of these tracks has been turned off with the eyeball. I'm going to turn that back on. And this adjustment layer, if I turn it off, look in the program monitor, if I turn it off and turn it back on, what this adjustment layer is applying is applying an effect to the overall clip. But because the adjustment layer is on top of this entire track, it's applying that same effect to all three clips. And the effect is, if I click on this adjustment layer, collapse my motion tab, is brightness and contrast. Now this is an effect that's been added to this adjustment layer. This is not a fixed or default effect. This is actually a real added effect that has been applied to the entire adjustment layer on top of these clips. So this adjustment layer is actually impacting all three of these clips. And I can prove it to you by changing the brightness. I'm going to push it way up like this. And now the brightness in all three of these shots has been turned way up. Or I can drag the brightness way down. Same thing. This is what's called an adjustment layer, which is sometimes a very useful way to apply a filter to a group of clips to sort of tie them together to give them a same stylistic feel. And we'll see more about adjustment layers later. There is another manner to deal with mismatches and clip sizes versus sequence sizes. We're going to look at this in project lesson 09, go to edit 05, auto reframe. I'm not a big fan of this method, but we're going to take a look at it anyway. Notice I shrink my track. I really don't need my tracks to be that high, but anyway. And the program monitor.
All children sit at the right hand of mercy.
There's a clip here. I'm going to try to play it back fast with a couple of L's. You can play it back fast. But the camera's trying to keep track of this clip, and it kind of jumps around all over the place. It's one continuous shot, but you can see, especially around here, it kind of loses the framing of the actor's face. Now, with the auto reframe sequence selected, go to the Sequence drop-down menu and select Auto Reframe Sequence, all the way down here. It's going to give you a couple of options. Obviously, you can give the sequence a new name. I'm just going to call this new name. And I'm going to change it to, let's say I would change it to a custom shape. I'm going to change it to 4x3, which is a TV shape. Now I'm going to leave everything else normal. Recreate it. Now you can see it has reframed it into a, this is the original one, which was sort of more 16:9. The new name now is in a more of a standard TV type of frame. And so you can see it's reframed the clip into this new sequence. And if I click on the clip and go to my effects controls, my motion tab is disabled. But in my auto reframe here, if I needed to make any adjustments, let's say maybe here, I could turn on overwrite generated, but I can jump through each one of these keyframes and readjust the clip. Say I could take this keyframe and move it more over here. This keyframe, for example, I can adjust because I have extra clip on this side. So I could push it over. That would be a better result. And again, this one as well. So there are adjustments that you can make manually once you've sort of done this overall applied effect to your clip to fit it inside a sequence that is mismatched. Now, in my opinion, this is sort of the hammer approach to the problem. In other words, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This is a bit heavy-handed. I really don't think I would do it that way because I'm having to go in here and readjust them by hand anyway, so I would have done this by hand with many fewer keyframes than that. And I would have simply made some decisions early on as to how to address these clips. But this is a quick way to get an approximation of resizing the clip, or at least moving the clip around to fit inside a sequence that is smaller, for example, in this case, than the clip itself. All right, so that's a tool that you might use once in a while, but again, I think it's a little bit heavy-handed. I probably wouldn't use it. It is doing a little bit of analysis on the clip. So, and you can see it's basically looking at, and if I go to fit here, it's looking at the center of the clip and it's trying to match the center of the clip and all these different clips. It's not doing a great job of it, but just a quick note on this auto reframe type of thing. This is the type of thing that will get better with AI, because AI will be able to do a lot more specific analysis on these clips. So expect this to be a type of effect or adjustment that will get better in the future with AI. And these clip mismatches, sequence mismatches, frame rate mismatches, all these things also will get better with AI in the future. AI will probably take care of that. And as an editor, all you will have to do is sort of adjust the AI so that it's not introducing too many noisy frames. That's what I expect will happen in the future. Let's go into the project window and double click on the sequence called 06 Enhance. I'm going to hit home and play this sequence. And it's a little montage of Andrea Sweeney with some B-roll and a graphic on top. We're going to apply an effect here. I'll make this track a little bit less tall. And to do that, I'm going to go into my effects panel. And I'm going to use my setting, which is called full with effects. And the effects window is up on the right-hand side. This is the way I've laid it out. There's another layout called effects right here, which is a Adobe layout. I'm not a particular fan of that because it throws my project window down here. And it has all these other additional windows that I typically don't use, like info, etc. So I'm going to go back to my full with effects, and I'm going to look in the Finder right here for an effect called perspective. Perspective. I don't need to draw out the whole thing. And inside the folder called perspective, there's two effects that I want to look at in this lesson. One is drop shadow, the other one is basic 3D. So right now we're going to select the drop shadow one. And let's go to the timeline, make sure that the graphics clip with the logo on it, Journey to New York, is selected. And we're going to drag that effect right onto that clip by clicking and dragging. Now I'm going to open up the effects control panel. Now the effects control's got my drop shadow right here. Because I have this clip selected in the timeline. Remember, whichever clip is selected in the timeline is the clip that we're applying the effect to here. So, and now I'm going to just go through some settings in the drop shadow. What I like to do for drop shadows is I don't like to leave it black. I always change the color to blue, dark blue. I pick a blue like this, a dark blue. If the background is a cool background, I pick a dark blue. If it's a warm background, I'll pick a dark red or dark purple. Just to show you the distance, I'll increase the distance, and now you can really see the drop shadow here. I'll also increase the opacity. Now that's the opacity at 100%, so you can really see the drop shadow now. If you increase the softness, what it does is it blurs the edges. You see, like that? So I like to blur the edges and then decrease the opacity, give it more of a transparent look. And then of course bring the distance back in so it's more like that. A lot of times what I like to do is make it subtle. In this case, if I turn the effect off, by the way, if you click on this effects FX button right here, you turn off the effect. So you can preview what it was like before and what it's like with the effect. And you can see the shadow, drop shadow is pretty subtle. That's like 78% opacity. Another thing you can do, which I tend to do oftentimes, is to grab a color, match into a color that's already on screen. So I can match into this light gray, you see, and I might want to reduce my opacity a little bit. That also gives me enough separation from the background. If I turn off the effect, it looks like that. I turn it back on, it looks like this. And now if I play back my clip, go to my timeline, and my drop shadow is on top of all the other clips. Now if I look at this shot right here, my drop shadow is lighter than this dark part of the image here, which means that I need to get a darker value. So I would rather go get a dark blue like I had before. And that blends in better, you see, with the image. So typically I'll use blue instead of black. Or, you know, I could have used a dark red as well. Same thing. It just gives it a little bit more lift. The red actually here ties in with the outline of the font. So it's very subtle. Let's go to our project window again and select motion and transform. And in this sequence, I'll just play down this sequence real quick. There's a clip that's spinning on top of the other clips here. This is a bit random, the way they've made this, but it doesn't really make any sense story-wise. I think they're just trying to illustrate a principle here. And so we have this clip that's spinning on top. And if I click on it, it's the one, remember, the order of clips matters. It's the one that's on top. The clip on top has the drop shadow applied. If I go to my effects controls, actually I'm going to invert the order here. It's got a drop shadow applied. But notice that it's also got a motion animation applied, which is a position and a rotation move. You can see the keyframes right here. Okay. So what that's doing is that if you look at the drop shadow at the beginning of the move is to the right of this frame. So you would then think that the light is coming from the upper left-hand corner of the frame. But when it spins, now the drop shadow is at the left of the frame. And that doesn't make any sense. That's not realistic. That doesn't make any sense. And the reason why that's happening is simply because the drop shadow is not a fixed effect. When you add the drop shadow by dragging and dropping it, it is not a fixed effect. It is an additional effect. Remember, motion, opacity, time remapping are fixed effects. They're default effects. They're always applied. But the order of the effects is important. Now, even though drop shadow is at the bottom of our list here, in fact, drop shadow gets applied first. And motion, opacity, or time remapping, any of these fixed effects get applied last. I know it's misleading because they're at the top of the list, but they get applied last. And this is in every circumstance. So anytime you apply an effect to a clip, the effect will apply will apply before the motion effect. So for example, we're doing a spin move in the motion tab. Therefore, the drop shadow is being applied first to the clip, and then the spin's being applied, which means that the drop shadow is actually being spun as well. So we don't want that. So how do you remedy that? Well, there's a way to get another effect, which is called transform. Where is it? Right here in the distort folder, and I'm going to apply that instead. Now if you look at my effects control, I've got drop shadow and transform. I'm going to take transform and I'm going to drag it on top of drop shadow. Okay, so now everything that I do in my transform effect will happen before the drop shadow is applied. I'm also going to my motion tab, and I'm going to get rid of that rotation by clicking on the stopwatch, and it's going to say this action will delete all keyframes, and I'm going to hit yes, that's what I want. Okay, so now all I have is this move right here, and I can even get rid of the move in both the case. You see how I reset the rotation there to 0 as well? And the position. The scale, I'm going to leave the scale at 37%. So now we don't have the move anymore. But I'm going to replicate that move using my transform effect. So transform, notice we have a lot of similar things. Got an anchor point, got a position, got a scale. We got a skew axis, rotation, opacity, shutter angle, sampling. Okay, that's a little bit different. There's a little bit extra things here. But if I select my position stopwatch, I can move it over to the left again. And then I can go to my other keyframe. Remember, one step back. And move that back to the center. I could give it a rotation. Let's start it upside down like this. Turn on the animation, go to the other keyframe, and come back to 0. So now it's going to do this. Notice the drop shadow. Now the drop shadow is in the right place. It stays to the right of the clip. If I look at this clip and I put the drop shadow before the transform effect, notice that the drop shadow is behaving like it did before. So here it's on the left and here it's on the right. The order of effects is very important. It's going to read from top to bottom, but it's going to always take motion, opacity, time, remapping, and slap them on at the end of your list. We're going to look at one more effect. We're going to go to 08 Basic 3D. Again, these in the sequence, these clips are giant. I don't need them to be that big. And look at how many empty clips, empty tracks there are. I'm going to go ahead and delete these tracks. So that my sequence is much more tidy. Backslash, shrink my sequence. Always maximizing real estate here. And if I look at this clip here, what I've got is a 3D style effect. If I click on the clip and go into my effects control, Basic 3D has been applied. Remember, Basic 3D, that was in the perspective folder. There it is, Basic 3D. Let me delete this. Okay, so I've got my clip selected in the timeline. I open up my effects control window. I click on my Basic 3D and I hit delete. That gets rid of that effect. Now, if I want to apply a default Basic 3D effect to this clip, all I need to do is select my timeline, make sure my clip is selected, and double click on Basic 3D. And you saw it pop up here in my effects control. That's another way to apply an effect. But as you can see, nothing is happening. And that's because I haven't animated it yet. So go to my first frame in my sequence, or my clip rather. In my Basic 3D, I'm going to turn on animation for the swivel parameter and for the tilt parameter. I'm going to go to my last frame in my sequence. Remember, one down arrow, one back arrow. And now I'm going to apply a swivel and a tilt like this. So if I animate it, it looks like this. Now I have a loop playback engaged in my program monitor. So if I play it, it's going to loop playback. But you can see how the clip gets tilted like that. Now notice in the previous example there was a little bit of a highlight. You can turn that on right here. Show specular highlight. There's your specular highlight. You can obviously also animate it. I guess the only way to animate that would be to turn it on and turn it off, because you can't move it per se. No, I can't really move it. So there, I'll just turn it on. And the specular highlight gives it a little bit of more of a, tricks the eye into believing that it's more of a 3D effect. Now, to even enhance this 3D effect, I'm going to select the clip in my timeline and double click on drop shadow. So now I also have a drop shadow. The drop shadow is applied. Of course, it's not, if I go to my motion transform, it's not as obvious as that one or as nice as this one. But I can copy this filter here from the Journey to New York clip by right-clicking on this clip here, copy. Notice I have a bunch of sequences open in my timeline, and I can scroll through them just by doing H, remember, or Shift 3 in case you didn't change the keystroke. I did a copy, and now I can go to my basic 3D and note what happens if I do a right click, paste attributes. All these other attributes turn on. Everything's turned on. So I'm going to turn all these off because I do not want to change these attributes. All I want to paste is the drop shadow. I'm going to hit OK, drop shadow. Now look what happened. I can see the red drop shadow. It's there. But look at my effects tab. There's 2 drop shadows. That's because any effect that is not one of these 3 fixed effects is going to be additive. In other words, this list, you can keep adding to this list. It's called additive effects. And also the order matters. So in this case, now I have 2 drop shadows. So that's something that I don't want. I can just select the first one and hit delete. It's gone. And now my drop shadow is that nice red one that I kept from my previous animation. I can play it back. And in this case, I would probably also change the speed because I think it's a little bit slow. So let's put it at 150%. And if I play it back, it plays this clip back a little bit faster. But the clip underneath it remains at the same speed. Okay, so that is a basic introduction to effects and how to apply effects in the effects control window. Remember, effects are additive. The order of the effects matters. The parameters of the effects can be changed. Now, I can animate any of these parameters. We saw how we animated this basic 3D, but I can also animate the drop shadow if I wanted to. For example, I could put the, if I wanted to follow the basic 3D keyframes, I'm going to uncollapse it so that I can see my basic 3D keyframes here. And I'm going to navigate between my basic 3D keyframes using these arrows. That's much more specific than trying to drag the playhead. I'm going to leave my drop frame, the distance of my drop shadow, I meant to say the distance of my drop shadow at 18. But I'm going to go to the last keyframe in my basic 3D, which is there, and I'm going to increase. Now I'm about to make a mistake here, but I want to show you what happens. So I'm going to increase the distance to 88. So what happened? Well, the distance got increased to 88 throughout the entire clip. That's not what I wanted. So that is because I forgot to turn on the distance stopwatch. So I turn on the distance stopwatch. And now, if I come back to my previous keyframe, I can turn this back to 18. And now I will have animated the drop shadow as well. And so the drop shadow gets further and further away from the clip as the clip spins. Very subtle, but just wanted to show you that you can also animate the drop shadow. I could actually also even animate its position, its direction, if I wanted it to be more like this. I could animate its direction and come back and for the direction to be more like this. You see, now I've animated the direction, the distance as well. And you can animate other things like the opacity and all that other stuff. So that's your basic introduction to applying filters and effects inside the effects control window. All right, so we're done with lesson 9. I'm going to go ahead and save as. We've made some changes. Work in progress 2, just in case you want to come back to it later and see what you did. Save it as work in progress 2. I'm going to close this lesson. And now we're going to open lesson 12. So we're jumping ahead a little bit here. And notice lesson 12 opens in the same full with effects layout that I was using previously. We're going to go ahead and in the lesson project window, I'm going to click on the name column header so that it orders the different sequences by name, and I'm going to click on sequence number 2, double click to load it. Again, I find it a little bit tall. And I'm going to hit my backslash. Notice my window is still at 25% and my program monitor. I'm going to go to my effects window over here. Notice the effects window is different from the effects control window. The effects control is where you determine the parameters of your effect. The effects window is where you go and find an effect. So we're going to look for an effect called black and white. So I'm going to type in white. And right here in the image control, I have the black and white effect. And I'm going to drag that effect right onto this clip here in the sequence. Notice that the sequence clip, if it's not selected, there's nothing in the effects control panel. Doesn't matter where the playhead is. I have to select a clip for the effects to appear. And I can either drag the black and white effect over here to the effects control panel or onto the clip here. Now notice I'm going to go back to my program monitor. I'm going to set it to fit, which will give me the largest screen. It's already applied the black and white effect here. And this black and white effect does not have any keyframes that allow me to animate it. It's either there or it's not. So the black and white effect has been applied. Now you can turn on and turn off the effect by clicking on the effects button here. We saw that earlier. You can remove the effect by clicking on the effect and hitting delete, and the effect is gone. We're going to go get another effect. So remember, here in this effects window, you've got your search bar. If your search bar has a word or even just a letter in it, you're not going to see all your available effects. You're only going to see the effects that have that word in it. So if I get rid of that word by hitting on the X here, and I open my video effects folder, there's all my other effects that I wasn't seeing before. So keep that in mind. We're going to go look for another effect called direction. It's actually called directional blur, but I'm just going to type direction. Here's a directional blur. I'm going to drop it onto my clip. And this time, notice nothing happened because this is an animated effect. So in my effects control panel, I'm going to position the playhead at the beginning of the clip, and I'm going to turn on the animation for blur length by clicking on the stopwatch. That introduces a keyframe. I'm going to pull my clip forward here. Let's say all the way to here. I'm going to change the blur length to 18. I'm going to change the direction like that. Notice the direction, if you uncollapse it, has a little circle. That's easier to manipulate. And I'm going to introduce a keyframe there as well in the direction parameter. So now the blur, it starts without a blur, and then the blur happens when she's running. And I could even introduce another keyframe right here and take the blur back to 0 so that it does something like this. She's running, there's a blur, and then the blur goes away when she stops. I can play it down. Now, if I had made the blur, remember, to navigate through my keyframes, use these little navigation arrows. If I had made my blur length 104, wow, that would have been completely illegible. So, I'm going to put it back to 18. But notice, we already saw this also before. This is where you alter the parameters by sliding these numbers. Also, if I uncollapse this, we have a slider here. The slider only goes to 20, but if I slide my numbers, I can keep going beyond what that slider allows me to do. The slider only goes to 20, but the numbers keep going. So don't ever let yourself be limited by that slider. I don't know why they would do that. I think that's just a programming shortcut that they took. It's unfortunate, but rely on the numbers. Also, you will probably be taking notes sometimes with these numbers if you're doing a very specific type of edit. So pay attention to the numbers and pay attention to the keyframes. Now, I can drag this second keyframe, which is here. I'll put it back to 18. I can move that keyframe by selecting it and moving it back a little bit or forward a little bit. I can even move it beyond that previous keyframe. Now, let's say I wanted to get rid of this effect. I can also click on the name and hit delete, or I can just go to the hamburger icon and effects control and remove selected effects. And my effect is gone. Let's put the directional blur back onto this clip. And let's also get the black and white effect. Drop it on this clip as well. So now I have two effects, and I'm going to just increase the blur like that so that it's obvious what's happening. Now my blur effect is no longer animated. However, I did alter the parameters of the blur. I can also alter the direction, remember. So the blur is there, but it's not animating. I know it's a bit distracting. It doesn't do anything particularly good to the picture, but I just want to show you the stacking clip effects here, directional blur and black and white. Let's say I want to go and get rid of directional blur and black and white. I can go click on my hamburger icon, remove effects plural, and it's going to give me a whole list of effects that I can decide to remove. Let's say I had done a motion animation by starting the clip off screen here, doing a down arrow, one step back, sliding the clip over there. You can see if I turn on my motion tab, you can see the rubber band. I could even do this. I could even select my rubber band like this. So now this clip does this as well as have the directional blur and the black and white filter applied to it. Let's say I want to remove all these filters all at once, including the motion effect. I can click right here and go remove effects, and it gives me a list of effects that I can remove. If I just hit OK, it's going to remove everything, including the motion animation. Okay, now we're going to go look at in the project lesson, I'll move it here, multiple effects. Let's open that sequence. I'm going to hit a backslash real quick. I'm going to play it, but I'm going to play it quickly. I'm going to do a couple of L's there. So it's basically a scene. And you can see there's all kinds of different shots. In particular, there was a shot here that I saw. This shot right here just looks different from this shot. The lighting looks different. The time of day looks different. The sky looks different. It looks also very different from this shot. This clearly was shot in the morning or the evening. And this just looks like the whole area is in shade. So that's not necessarily a good sequence of shots there, but we're going to try to do something to improve that a little bit. I'm going to shift scroll on top of these clips here. I do not need them to be that tall. I'm going to select the project panel, and down here next to the trash can, I'm going to click on new item. And in my new item, I have a list of different things that I can bring up. Some of the most useful ones are going to be bars and tone. That's useful sometimes. Black video, that's just basically a black frame, or black video that you can extend for however long you need black for. Color matte, that's color, a whole frame of color. But what we're going to do here, of course, we can also create a new sequence. What we're going to do here is create an adjustment layer. And it's going to say what size do you want it, and what frame rate do you want it, and what pixel dimensions do you want it. And we're just going to say, okay, that's all the default of the sequence. And in the project window, the adjustment layer was created. Note it has a graphic still icon and has my purple color associated with it. So an adjustment layer is considered kind of like a graphic, which is perfectly suitable to the purpose we're going to use it for. You could drag it onto the timeline, but we're going to try to do this a little bit better. We're going to double click on it. Note there's nothing but black video inside this adjustment layer. We're going to select H, we're going to select home. We're going to select track V2 and patch track V1 into V2, and we're going to select overwrite, or I could have done period. That's going to lay my adjustment layer on top of my other clips on track V2. Now notice the length of my adjustment layer, if I look in my source window here, is 4 seconds and 23 frames long. It's right here. My program is 1 minute, 30 seconds and 19 frames. So obviously the two lengths don't match. I need to extend this adjustment layer out to the end of the clip because I want to apply this adjustment layer to all the clips in the sequence. So I'm going to select my sequence. I'm going to do this with keystrokes. I'm going to hit end. I'm going to grab, by selecting it, note that my cursor turns into this edit tool. I'm going to select the edit or the last frame of that adjustment clip and hit E. And E is going to extend my entire adjustment layer to my playhead position. Now I could have put my playhead here and hit E. I have to select my clip here, and it would have stopped there. I could have also, of course, extended it by hand, okay, but by hand you could have easily done something like this, whereas if I hit end, I know that my playhead's exactly at the end of my sequence, and I hit E, I know that my adjustment layer went exactly to my playhead position. Now a quick note. Previously, in a previous lesson, I had turned my ripple tool shortcut to be E, which I used as my ripple tool shortcut. By default, the ripple edit tool is B, which I explained I don't like because B reminds me of the blade tool, which is what I used to use in Final Cut Pro. But anyway, so right now my ripple edit tool does not have a shortcut because I went into my keyboard shortcuts and I reassigned E to extend selected edit to playhead position. So hopefully yours is still set to that. But in case you had followed me and set your ripple edit tool to E, this is where you set it back to extend selected edit to playhead. Okay. So E is a useful tool. You can give this any other keyboard shortcut you want, but I guess E for extend is good enough. So now we're going to add a effect to this note. I'm still in my ripple tool. Hit V. Now I'm in my pointer tool. I'm going to make this track just a little bit taller so I can select it easier. And I'm going to apply an effect to it. I'm going to go to my effects window. I'm going to hit the X, get rid of my white search term there, and I'm going to look for a blur effect. I'm going to go to video effects, and I'm going to go here and blur and sharpen. And there's a bunch of different blurs. Remember, we already used a directional blur. I'm going to get Gaussian blur, and I'm going to drop it onto my clip. I could have also just, with my clip selected, double-clicked on it. Now, I double-clicked on it. Looks like nothing happened here. Nothing's changed. Why? Well, I have my adjustment layer selected, but I haven't animated that parameter yet. So if I go to Effects Controls and turn that on, there's my Gaussian blur right here. The blurriness is set to 0. So in order to see it, I need to actually start to blur things by making that parameter higher than 0. So they say put it at 25. I don't know why. That seems like a lot. I'm going to put it at 10. That's already a lot. They say to turn on repeat edge pixels, and the reason why is because if I have edge pixels turned off, you can see there's a little black. If I blur more and more and more, you can see now I'm starting to get a black outline here. That's because the blur, it's blurring in what's outside of the clip, which is black. So I need to turn repeat edge pixels on in order that that black should not show. And I'm going to turn this back down to 10. Now I'm going to do something else that's not in the book. I'm going to go get an image control parameter, and I'm going to get gamma correction. I'm going to drop that on here, the adjustment layer. Right here, I'm going to hit Alt, collapse all my arrows. So now you see motion opacity, timer mapping, Gaussian blur, gamma correction. I want my gamma correction to happen before my blur. I'm going to uncollapse this, and I'm going to uncollapse this gamma parameter just so I can grab the slider. And I'm going to add just a little bit of higher contrast to this shot. So now I've applied 2 filters to my adjustment layer, and it's just made everything look blurry. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into my opacity tab here, and I'm going to go to my blend mode. And my blend mode, if I look at my drop down menu in my blend mode, there's a bunch of options. These are called blend modes or composite modes. And what they do is they do the clips underneath it. So let's go ahead and select a couple of different ones to see what it looks like. I'm going to select color dodge. Color dodge blows everything out. Interesting effect, but that's probably not what I want. Instead, I'm going to look for soft light and apply soft light. And now I've got sort of this very subtle, because remember my blur is at 10. I have this very subtle effect that's been applied to my adjustment layer clip.
If you try to be in control,
And so it kind of ties in all the other clips together now, because they've got a nice little blur effect on them and a nice little gamma correction effect on them too. Now, to be honest,
are one with us.
I wouldn't be satisfied with this.
One
I would have to go in and
us.
color correct these shots to
Everything
tie them
you
in
see
together
is part
even
of a
more.
living, breathing organism.
But for now, this is a good start. And in particular, you can see when this shot is nicely blurred out. So we have a little bit of a film type effect here. Now, of course, I'm viewing it in my program monitor at half resolution. If I turn it to full resolution, it should look a little bit nicer. You see
are
the
water
blur
in this
is
pond, the earth beneath you,
very, very
the
subtle
air you breathe in your lungs. All the
and full
elements around
resolution.
I am unsure. how
But
to be more than
the
this body.
gamma correction
and be
has
the
introduced a little
If you
bit
do this, you will be
of
part
color
of forces
correction to
greater than
this
you and I. You will be acting a force
sequence,
in all
starting to give it a little bit more of a tied-in look, so the clips are not as jarring as they were before. Now, this is just basically to show you how you can use filters or effects inside an adjustment layer that then can apply to a whole group of clips. Of course, you can apply effects directly to the clip, but the adjustment layer gives a little bit more flexibility to everything so that you can kind of work on the adjustment layer to get it just right. And that will apply to all your clips underneath. So that's a good trick. The adjustment layers are very useful in that manner. You can work on a look for a whole scene and apply it through your adjustment layer. And that is a quick way to apply effects to a large number of clips. We saw how to apply effects to clips in the sequence. We also saw how to apply effects to an adjustment layer, which is a very good tip. Now we're going to go to project lesson 12 and turn on source clip effect. I'm going to double click on that sequence. And I'm going to shrink that track a little bit. We saw how to drop effects onto clips in the sequence. We saw then how to look into the effects control panel and adjust those effects. Now, the clips in the sequence, we have a bunch of clips of Laura here and Andrea Sweeney. The clips in the sequence are what is called instances of the master clip. Now, we can see that because these clips all have blue bars at the bottom of them, which means that these are all different instances of the same clip. Now, if I want to see what clip that is, I can either right-click, reveal in project, or I can simply look in my effects control panel. It says this is the instance of the Laura 02 clip inside the source clip effects. I'm going to change that name. This is very, very misleading. I'm going to change that name to Laura. Edit. Okay, so I changed the name of this sequence to Laura Edit. If I click on this clip, I go to my effects control. Now you can see it says the name of the sequence is Laura Edit, and the name of the clip is Laura. But over here on the left-hand side, if I click on that, it loads the original clip inside the source monitor. This is the original clip with all its handles and everything. I can even get rid of the mark in and mark out points by clicking Control-Shift-X. And this is the original clip bare of any mark in and mark outs. So in the effects control panel, I can select either the clip in the timeline or the source clip here. And the reason for that is so that if, for example, I now put a black and white effect onto this clip in the source panel by dragging it over here, I have made the original master source clip black and white, the entire clip. What does that mean? Big deal. Well, if I go down into my timeline sequence, every time the Laura clip comes up, it's in black and white. No matter how many times it's in the sequence. Now these are repeats of the same shot, right? This Laura clip is exactly the same shot copied over, but I could go ahead and slip this, and now the blue bar, you can see the blue bar is showing me that, you see how the blue bar is truncated now? It's showing me that only some of the frames are repeated in every single instance of this clip. And I was able to move every instance of this clip independently from the source clip inside the sequence. But I'll go back to my pointer tool. They all remain black and white. You see, it doesn't really matter. Like this part is different from this part, different from this part. That's because I applied the effect to the source clip. Let's say I wanted to apply that gamma correction again. If I double clicked here, this is a snap quiz. Where would this gamma correction be applied? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It would be applied. Let's go ahead and double click here. Oh, it did not get applied to the source clip. No, it didn't. It got applied to this last clip in the sequence, Laura 02, because that was the clip that was selected. So if I now change the gamma, notice this is the only clip that gets the gamma correction. That was a trick question. Let's do something even more tricky. I'm going to reveal a completely different clip in the source monitor. So now I have a clip in the source monitor. The play is over a different clip in the sequence, and I'm going to select the last clip in my timeline. So now if I double click on posterize, where did that effect get applied? Well, you saw that this yellow bar turned red over the LoRa 02 clip here. And that is because if I just double click on this clip, it's going to load it in the source monitor. I hit effects controls. There's my posterize. And if I change the posterize, nothing's happening. Why? Well, because my playhead's on top of the Sweeney clip in this timeline. I would have to move my playhead over here to see the effects of posterize. There's my posterize effect. So now this clip is posterized, but this Sweeney clip, nothing happened to it because it was just where the playhead was. It was neither selected. And this clip, which was loaded into the program monitor, the source monitor, did not have the posterize effect applied to it because double clicking on effect applies the effect to whichever clip is selected in the sequence. I know this is all confusing, but it's important to keep in mind. The playhead, what displays in the program monitor is what's under the playhead. What displays in the source monitor is whatever has been loaded into the source monitor. It doesn't mean that it's selected in the timeline. See, I could have this clip over here selected in the timeline, yet this clip is showing in the source monitor. If I double click on this Andrea Sweeney clip here and load it into the source monitor, note that now what's in the source monitor is only this instance of the clip. In order to get the original source clip, I would need to do one of two things. I could go to the effects control panel and click on source evening smile. And now this is the original source clip. Note it does not have an in to out. Watch the difference. If I double click, I want to just put my playhead over this so that we're all on the same page here. Watch it. What happens if I double click on this Andrea Sweeney clip? It loads the clip. However, it loads the marked portion of the clip, which is the instance of the clip inside the sequence. If I want to see the master clip, I can either do effects control, go to click on source evening smile. Now note this is not marked anymore. This is the master clip. Or I could have done another thing, which was to select, put my playhead, let's say, over this LoRa clip and hit F. Now F loaded the LoRa clip into the source monitor, the original master clip. And I can verify that by applying posterize to this source clip here. And now every instance of the LoRa clip in the sequence is now posterized. Okay? So double clicking on a clip loads the instance of the clip into the source monitor. If I go to effects controls, and in this case, I drop black and white into my effects controls here. Now, which clip got black and white applied to it? Well, it would be the instance of this clip in the timeline. You see? And I had to load it up by going to that clip in the timeline. Note that the icon does not update to black and white. It stays color. That's why these icons, I typically don't really pay attention to them. I typically edit with everything just smashed down like that, and that allows me to use my color labels a lot more efficiently. But and in this case, it's important to point these different things out. Now, if I go back into my effects control, notice which side of this 2-up title is selected. It's the Laura Edit Evening Smile, meaning it's the instance of Evening Smile inside the Laura Edit. Let's do this again. Let's go scrub the playhead to this Andrea Sweeney shot. And remember, I'm going to match frame this into my source monitor. The keyboard shortcut is F. That loaded my master clip into the source monitor. If I go to my effects control, it shows you rooftop mid, this is the master clip, not the instance. Now, if I apply an effect to the master clip, I'll go get a gamma correction, drop it on here. Nothing happens because I didn't change the gamma correction. I go to effects control, here's my gamma. And if I change it, watching the program monitor, you can see the gamma was changed. I'll bring it back a little bit to enhance the contrast. Now, if I go back to my source monitor, you can see the source monitor and the program monitor both match. That is because I applied the gamma correction directly to the master source clip. So every subsequent instance of that clip, even if I lay it at the end of my sequence one more time, I just did a overwrite at the end of my sequence. It's here, it's here. It's always going to have that gamma correction applied to it. Now, if I'm looking at my sequence, I might not be able to tell that this effect has been applied to the source clip rather than the instance. Well, there's a little badge that you can turn on here by turning on this monkey wrench here and going to show effects badges. And now you see I've got a little red effects badge underlined in red that tells me that there's an effect that's been applied, but if it's been applied to the source clip, it's underlined in red. So that's a good heads up to remember to turn on your effects badge if you're doing this kind of work by applying clips directly to source, by applying effects directly to source clips. Now, why is this convenient? Well, let's just say you have this clip is 14 seconds long. Let's say you want to select 2 parts of this clip. One in to out is here. I'm going to get rid of this last instance of it, hit end, and I'm going to drop this down. And if I go to this clip here and slip it out of sync with the other clip, oh, I can't. There's not a whole lot of footage there. Well, it shows that I've reused a little bit of this footage, this little red portion here. But because the source clip, let me do a ripple here really quick. Get my ripple and get rid of that. Okay, so now these two instances of this Andrea Sweeney clip, as a matter of fact, I'm going to get rid of everything in between, just to make it easy. These two instances here are completely different selects, remember, selected trims of this clip, same clip. Now, if I just go here and let's say stylize, and I'm going to do posterize. If I select this instance, put my playhead over it, and I select this instance of the Andrea clip and I double click posterize, the posterize only applies to this clip, because if I scrub backwards, this clip does not have the posterize on it. Yet they both have the gamma correction. So it's important to understand the difference between the master source clip and the instance inside the sequence, and where the effect gets applied. It can get applied onto the instance of the clip versus getting applied to the source clip itself, which will then be universally applied to any instance of that same source clip inside the sequence. All right. So now if I double click on this, load this clip into the source, it's showing me the source clip, but if I go to my effects control, I've got my posterize right here, which is showing me the instance of this source clip, which has been basically altered. Now, one more way of applying an effect to a source clip. I'm going to select this lower clip. I'll just put the play on top of it just so we have it loaded here. And I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to go reveal in project. So here's my lower clip inside the project. Well, I can take Alpha Glow, for example, and drop it straight onto that name. Now be careful, because what happens is, you see how everything moved around like that? I'm going to again reveal in project. There's my lower clip. Be careful, because you've got a lot of stuff in this project lesson 12 window. I'm going to take the Alpha Glow. I can go and get I'm going to go into my color correction folder and get a tint. I'm going to drag this tint on top of the lower clip. I'm going to double click on this clip to load it in the source monitor. Go to Effects. And in the tint, it says you can map whatever is black to a color and whatever is white to another color. So I'm going to map whatever is black to a deep red, for example. And whatever is white, I'll map it to a light blue. So now you have an effect like that. And because I applied this effect to the master clip or the source clip, all three instances had that effect applied to it. So that's how you can apply an effect to a source clip in the project list view by just dragging it onto its list name inside the project panel. Now notice this LoRa 2 clip has this effect applied to it. And I can see it if I go to my effects controls. But if I load the LoRa edit instance of the clip, which is under my playhead here, notice it does not show the tint effect. Nor does this one. If I double click on this one, no tint effect. Or if I double click on this one, effects control, no tint effect. That's because the tint effect was applied to the source. Now, if I click right here, remember, this is the instance. Here's the source. If I click on the source, there's my tint effect. It's been applied to the master source clip. So, important to remember the distinction between the two. So in this Laura edit sequence, we're going to go to this Andrea Sweeney clip, the second one. And if I do some pluses here, and I look at my clip here, and the timeline, that was a bit misleading because there's some red behind her hair there, but the effects badge is not underlined in red. What that means that the effect has only been applied to the instance. So to prove that, with the playhead where it's at, I'm going to hit F. That loads my source clip in the source window. Go to Effects Controls. There are no effects applied to this source clip. You can see the source clip is not black and white. No effects have been applied. If I double click on this clip, however, and now go to my effects control, there's my black and white filter. I call them filters sometimes versus effects. Same difference in my mind. So the black and white filter has been applied to this clip, but only the instance of that clip. So what if we only wanted the black and white to apply to her face for whatever reason? Remember, we can make mattes. By clicking on that ellipse, I can make a circular matte, or I can make a square matte, or I can even draw a matte myself. And I'm going to go ahead and draw a matte that looks like this. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, I don't know, say if you wanted to do a jazzy color effect over this clip, you might want to do that. Now, of course, you can also animate this matte. Notice that when we play down this clip, the matte stays in place, but the shot kind of moves over to the left. Well, right here, there's, why do I have two masks? Oh, I'll get rid of that one, and I'll get rid of this one. Oh, no, I didn't mean to do that. Let me draw this one again. Oh, you also have Beziers that you can pull here. So let's say I wanted to track this matte over the instance of this clip while the camera is panning a little bit. Well, right here in mask 1, I have mask path. So I put my playhead at the beginning of this clip, and if I hit this forward arrow, this is going to track the clip moving forward from my playhead position to the end of the clip. Every frame gets a keyframe. And when it gets to the end of the clip, now if I play this clip back, I'm going to select this clip here, hit X, and if I turn my loop playback, it should play from in to out. You can see that the mask is now following the camera pan. Let's invert the mask. And let's play this back. So that's a type of effect that tracks the camera move and allows you to do a tracking matte, which is very convenient. So you have these options to track your matte, and note all the keyframes that it's introduced. I wouldn't suggest trying to go in there and edit them, but you could if you needed to. You also have a little wrench here that tells you that, in this case, I really didn't need scale and rotation because the clip was not really moving around that much. I could have satisfied myself with position only, but position, scale, and rotation are your three options. By the way, you can use a mask on almost any video effect. Let's go ahead inside the project window and open. Now you know why I like to keep my project window organized. This one is really not well organized. It's really all over the place. I'm not quite sure why they would do this. Well, I guess that's just a footage bin that's kind of all over the place like this. Yeah, that's not very well, this is just not very well organized. Anyway, I'm going to go back to this view here, and I'm going to look for sequence number 6, interpolation. Now, I'm going to go jump to my timeline, hit home, hit backslash, hit spacebar. We've got a little, I'm going to hit my loop playback. We've got a little film clip here where these fake explosives are going off. And notice there is a lens flare on this clip. I'm going to double click on this clip. Notice it's got an effects badge, so that means there's an effect that has been applied to it. Go to my effects control, and right here we can see there's a lens flare that's been applied to this particular clip. I'm going to collapse this effects panel here by going back to Beau's layout, sort of maximize some real estate here, and go back to my effects control. I don't need this footage bin here. Effects control, put it back here, put the project lesson there. Effects control. And that's because I want to see a little bit more of this interpolation stuff. With the lens flare selected, you can see there is a track where the keyframes have been set. The flare center keyframe starts there and ends there. Starts here and ends there. And the flare brightness goes from 100 to 148. Now we can change that by either moving these keyframes, selecting a keyframe and changing the value of it. See, there's a lens flare that's way too bright. I'm going to put the brightness, so let's put the brightness, let's go ahead and put the brightness way all the way up, see what happens. So it starts like this and it blows out, you see? So I animated the brightness on this lens flare. I think 240 is too much, but I'll bring it down to, let's say, 160. That's still very bright. But instead of moving the flare center by using these numbers here, I'm just going to grab this keyframe in my program monitor and move it over like this. And I can also, remember, grab part of my rubber band. Can I grab part of this rubber band here? And stretch it out like that. And I can grab this first keyframe and throw it way over here. And now if I play it back, it looks like some sort of UFO is flying overhead. So really, I don't want to move the center of the lens flare so much. So I'm going to bring it back and I'm going to just keep it right about here. And it's really kind of bouncing around, and that's on purpose. I just wanted to kind of, I'll put it down in here, and actually I'm going to straighten this out. I could either do that, or select this keyframe here and delete it, right? Select the first keyframe and right click on it and turn on spatial interpolation, turn linear back on. That's going to flatten it. Go to the last keyframe, right click on that, go to spatial interpolation, linear as well, and now I've flattened it back out. Now really, the center of my flare should really be up in the sky here. And should remain up here, maybe even go over to this side. Because really all we're looking for is these glints down here. So now the lens flare looks like it's coming from the sun, and that's a more natural type of effect. So you can alter keyframes in the program monitor, in the effects control monitor, in the timeline area of the effects control panel, and you can alter their interpolation by right-clicking on the keyframe itself. Click on the first keyframe in the flare brightness parameters. Hold down the Shift key and click on the second one as well. So now they're both selected. I could have also just clicked on the name, which selects them both at the same time. And now I could right-click on either one of them and go Continuous Bezier, and now the Continuous Bezier is applied to both keyframes. Okay, so in this sequence, 06 interpolation, we have a clip that has an effect applied to it, and the effect right here is the lens flare. And let's go ahead and apply another effect. I'm going to find a color correction effect, and I'm going to use brightness and control. We're sort of working at cross purposes here because the lens flare adds a lot of brightness, we're going to diminish that brightness a little bit and increase the contrast. Now, note the order of these two filters. One is the lens flares on top, then the brightness and control is underneath the lens flare. Let's say, okay, it did add a little bit of depth to this image, which is great, and the lens flare is still there. You can still see the lens flare happening here. Let's say I really like that combination of filters. I can save this as a preset. If I go Control-click on, in the Effects Control panel, click on Brightness and Contrast, and then Control-click on Lens Flare, I have them both selected. And now I can do a right-click and hit Save Preset. And now I can decide that I want to save this preset. It's a lens flare and contrast preset. And I can just give it a little bit of a description and say good contrast with lens flare. I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but anyway, just to show, this is just to show you what you can put in here. Now there's three types of applications to save. In other words, you can save the effect at scale, which means that anytime you apply this preset to a clip, it's going to scale the motion to the length of the clip. So it will be proportional to the length of the clip. So in other words, if I had a shorter clip, this lens flare would be accelerated. Let's just say that's not particularly useful. What I want is the lens flare to stay at the same speed, and I want it to begin at the beginning of the clip. So let's anchor it to the end point. You could also anchor it to the out point, etc. Those are your different types of options that you get to save. Now, if I hit OK, well, where did that go? I'll show you in the effects panel over here. If I close Video Effects and I open the presets folder here, I now have lens flare and contrast preset. So I saved this filter build as a preset. And I can go ahead and let me just go to Laura Edit. I'm going to hit backslash, and this is, I'm going to drop this filter preset onto this clip here. So I'm going to apply this preset to this clip that I selected in the timeline of Andrea Sweeney. I'm going to grab this preset and drop it on the clip. And now you see automatically there's my lens flare, and you can see the motion matches the previous clip, which is, in this particular case, I'll select this into out so I can play it back. Perhaps not exactly what I want into out. You can see the lens flare has slowed down to follow the length of the clip. So it's a little bit less jarring. There's that bump there in intensity, and that is that keyframe right here. I can see it in the effects control panel, and I can open this lens flare and contrast preset, and it shows me the lens flare here, And it tells you it's coming from this preset, and the contrast here, again, coming from this preset. So it applied this filter build, or this effects build, by simply dragging and dropping it. If I wanted to get rid of that middle keyframe, I could delete it this way. So now I'm not going to have that brightness bump there. And this clip has clearly been slowed down. You can see I've got a nice continuous lens flare effect. Now, the last effect in the lens flare brightness has been set to hold, which is why you get that little burst at the end. If I put this on auto Bezier, now you won't get that bump at the end. The intensity will just gradually increase and be a lot smoother. It looks like there's the sun in the shot. So that's how you can apply a preset. You can save a preset into your effects panel, and it goes into the presets folder, and then you can apply it to any other clip. For example, if I wanted to apply it to this clip, it's not going to particularly work on this clip, but I can go ahead and open it, lens flare and contrast, drop it down on this clip. There's my lens flare. And my timeline, I'm going to select X to play in to out. Of course, this doesn't work with this particular clip, but it's just the principle of showing you how I was able to apply this particular preset to this clip. Now, this clip already had a filter applied to it, I believe. It has a filter applied to the source clip. Remember, if I click on here, on the source, this is the, on the right-hand side, that is the instance of the clip, which is right here. But if I go to my effects control and click on where it says source, I'm loading the source, original source clip. And I already have a filter on here, which is the gamma correction. I can go and add another filter, and let's say I want to add a tint. I can drag this over here and add a tint. Now, it mapped everything to black and white, but I can change these colors, obviously, the way we did earlier for the Laura clip. Let me do it this way. I'll make this darker and make this brighter. I'll make it really bright. Now, also, I can adjust the amount of the tint so it's not so blatant. And I've sort of added a little bit of a sepia tone to it. And then this is the clip without the effect of the tint. This is the clip with the effect. Let's just say I like this sepia toning. Okay, so I can select these two effects in the effects control panel, click on the gamma correction and control click on the tint, right click, save preset, and just say sepia tint. And in the description say it's got a gamma and sepia tint. And I'll leave it on scale. Typically I would have left my presets on scale, but you can always change that, obviously, and hit OK. And now, if I go to this other clip in the timeline, remember we were playing around with these clips earlier. So this clip, the first clip, has this sepia tint to it. The second clip has this posterize effect to it. I'm going to click on this clip and get rid of the posterize effect. But what I want to do is I want to copy this sepia tint. And note it's already been copied. And that is because I applied it to the source clip. And you can see because my effects badge is underlined in red. Well, let's say I want to apply this sepia tint to this shot. Well, I go to my presets, look for sepia tint here, and just drop it on to this clip. And there, now I have it applied to this shot as well. Obviously, this shot also has that lens flare, which is still there, by the way. And as a matter of fact, the lens flare, if I look at my effects control panel, the lens flare gets applied first. So now I have two presets happening. I have the lens flare and contrast preset, which are these two filters. And I have the gamma correction and tint preset, which are these two filters. So, and you see it stacked the effects inside my effects control. I can change the order. I'm not going to do that now, but you could change the order of any of these filters once they're inside the effects control panel. So that is how you save a preset, and you can apply it to any number of clips later by saving it in the presets folder here in the effects panel. Another really useful tip is that if you have a preset that you really like and you're working on a group project, for example, this sepia tint's pretty neat. It's a nice little color correction option here. And you want the other editors in your group to use this or to have access to this same preset. You can go right here, select the preset, and go into your effects menu, the hamburger menu, and you can export this preset. And it's going to say, what do you want me to export it as? Obviously, sepia tint. And I'll just save it to my desktop. And now it's on my desktop right here, and I could email this to someone to try out on their own system. As a matter of fact, I'll do that. I'll put a link to this. You can save and export your presets and share them with other editors. Okay, we're going to look at another effect. Let's go to the project window and open Warp Stabilizer. That's sequence number 9. I'm going to hit home and play this back, and you can see that there's a shot here of a handheld camera on a boat, and it kind of wobbles a little bit. And then there's another shot of the snow, and it wobbles just ever so slightly. So these are two handheld shots. I'm going to get rid of the gap here. Not sure why they left a gap between these two clips. So we're going to go ahead and grab an effect called the Warp Stabilizer. So I'm going to just type Warp, and it's going to be here in the Distort folder. And I'm going to, with the clip selected in the timeline, double click on Warp Stabilizer. And it immediately starts to analyze the clip. And the analysis is going to allow it to then stabilize this clip. I'll go to my effects control, and you can see right here, it was analyzing the clip. Now it's stabilizing the clip, and you have different options on how to stabilize and how to apply this effect. So the result is you can choose how much motion that the shot is going to have. Smooth motion is going to allow some motion, but it's going to try to smooth it out. No motion is going to lock the shot in place, and see, it has to recalculate. But notice the difference there. See how much more zoomed in we are? Now, you can see there's a lot less motion in the background. But the boat still gets warped around. This actually imitates what iPhones tend to do, that jelly motion that iPhones do when they try to stabilize the image. And that's what I'm getting here, is I'm getting that jelly motion. So that's quite undesirable. So I would say, no, let's do smooth motion. It's going to recalculate it again. And you can determine how much smoothness you want. This is still doing a little bit of jelly. You can see, if you watch this pole, you can see it kind of warp and bend. You see there, bend. So you might want to turn the smoothness down a little bit. You have different methods of warping this image. Subspace warp is really what's introducing all this wobble, this jelly motion. So you could say, I just want to use position, scale, and rotation, which essentially just compensates for the motion of the camera instead of trying to re-warp the whole image. And you can see that's a lot smoother. There's a lot less jelly motion, although there's still a little bit of it here, but a lot less. In terms of the borders, what this means is that what I've done is I've stabilized the shot, but I've also cropped it and scaled it to fit. Because if I turn this off and only select stabilize only, you're going to start to see the edges of the clip. And you see the edges of the clip there? I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Let's make it 25%. You see the edges of the clip right here? And that is because, as a matter of fact, if I turn on my transparency grid, you would really see it better. You see the clip, how it's dancing around over my background? That is because by stabilizing the clip, it's moved the position, scale, and rotation of the clip, but it hasn't cropped it. So you can say stabilize it, but crop it. So now it's cropped into the clip at the lowest size that the clip gets to. But now you have this border, which is not a bad result, because you can then go into your motion tab here in your effects panel, and you could simply scale it up a little bit, scale the entire shot up a little bit to compensate for that crop. This is what I would choose to do. Or you could get rid of this motion adjustment and decide to let the warp stabilizer also auto scale it. If I play this clip down, this is probably the best result here. It's still warping this straight line here a little bit. So I would probably play around with these settings a little bit more. Note that the scale, you can make the scale bigger if you really want to get rid of the raggedy edges. This is just the scale of the crop here. So anyway, these are your different type of options for framing it. And then you have synthesized edges, which is kind of similar to what we saw with the Gaussian blur. It basically creates new edges by sampling the pixels along the edge. Let's go to the following clip. In the timeline, I want to hit X just to select in to out. And if I play this as a loop, you can see there's just a little bit of wobble here, not a whole lot. We're going to go ahead and apply this warp stabilizer to this clip. I'm going to double click on this clip, load it into the effects control, and drag my warp stabilizer onto it. Analyzing, you can see it's analyzing it right here in the background. 80%, 90%. Stabilized it. Let's see what it did now. There's still a little bit of motion to the shot. If I say no motion, and really I don't need subspace warp, I just need position, scale, rotation here. Now I play it back, that shot is locked down. But what's not locked down is the graphics logo or copyright here. See how that swims around now? So obviously that copyright was laid onto this clip later. So now we have a problem that the copyright is dancing around. So you're going to have to be aware of that. When you stabilize a clip, you can introduce other issues such as this one right here. So it's not an answer to every problem because it can introduce its own set of problems, but it can be very useful. One thing you could do here is obviously you could scale the crop to get rid of the copyright. And there you go, the copyright now is out of the picture and the shot is stabilized, but I've lost a lot of my shot. Could maybe drop it there like that. That would be one way to deal with it. All right, and that is warp stabilizer. Sometimes a useful way to get rid of a camera movement or something that moves around in the frame a little bit too much. Okay, we're going to look at another filter that's sometimes interesting, particularly in regards to when you're working on your edit and you have a lot of clips and you can't remember what they're all called. So go to your project lesson. We're going to double click on clip names. I'm going to hit backslash. I'm going to shrink this a little bit here. Definitely shrink the audio tracks. And if I hit home and play this down, there was a dissolve up. There's cross dissolves here. And the dissolve up gives me the checkerboard. That's because I have my transparency grid turned on. I'll turn it off and now it'll fade up from black. So essentially there's these traveling shots of trees. Looks like, oh, there's a monkey. Okay, so here's 3 shots. And let's say I want to apply a filter to all 3 shots. Well, I could copy the filter down onto all 3 shots. I could select all 3 shots and drop a filter onto it. Or I could go and create down here in my project panel a new adjustment layer. Let's do that. And notice we already had an adjustment layer, so it does not rename it a different name. So I'm going to click on this and give it a different name. And I'm going to call it Jungle Layer. All right. I'm going to double click on this. It's loaded into my source monitor. In my timeline, I'm going to hit H to select my timeline. It's select the V2 track, route this clip to the V2 track, hit overwrite. It's going to drop it on the top track there. Now I'm going to hit end. It's going to send my playhead to the end of my sequence. I'm going to select this clip, the end of this clip, and hit E. And that's going to extend it all the way to my playhead location. So now I have this adjustment layer on top of these three clips. Now there's nothing in this adjustment layer that's doing anything fancy because I haven't put an effect into it. If I click on this adjustment layer, turn on effects controls, there's nothing there. I can apply a filter by going, I'll go get something in my effects panel. I'll open the transform folder, and let's say I'll grab horizontal flip. All I need to do is double click here, and watch when I double click what happens in the picture here. The picture flipped. That is because in my timeline I had the adjustment clip selected. By double clicking on the effects, it applied the horizontal flip to my adjustment clip. And the adjustment clip applies this effect to all the clips that are underneath it. So every shot now has been flipped. And if I look at my effects control, here's the horizontal flip. If I turn it off, it flips back the other way. All right, so I've applied this particular effect using an adjustment layer, which is very convenient. But what I wanted to show you really is this. I'm going to look for clip name. And I'm going to double click on this, clip name, because the effects adjustment layer was selected in my sequence. It dropped that filter down. Here's the filter, it's called clip name. Now, what is it showing me? It's showing me the name of the adjustment layer, which is called Jungle Layer. By the way, I can adjust where this name sits by simply dragging on it. I have the clip name selected, and what I'm doing is I'm positioning this little circle here. I could put it down here, say Jungle Layer. This is very useful when you're editing and you have a bunch of clips and you can't remember what their names are. Or let's just say you have down in the timeline everything shrunk down like this. Or you might even have everything really squished in like this. Well, right now it says Jungle Layer, which is really just the top layer, right? It's the name of the adjustment clip. Well, I can set that down here in my effects control panel by telling it to display the source track that is on video 1 instead of video 2. And now it's going to tell me what the names of these clips are. So there's River 1, there's River 2, and Visitor. So this is a very convenient way to essentially give you some heads-up information on what these clips are. Obviously, you don't want to export this necessarily with the clip names on it, so you would turn this off before exporting, but it could be useful while you're editing. Another sometimes useful effect is time code. Notice I've already typed it here. All you have to do is type time. And here's the time code effect. If I double click on this, it's going to drop it on the adjustment layer because the adjustment layer is selected in the sequence. I'm going to collapse the clip name effect here. And I'm going to take a look at the time code effect. Right now, if I play this down, I'm going to go to the beginning of my sequence and play it down. It shows a running time code overlay. But this time code sort of starts at 24 minutes. It's not necessarily useful because that's kind of a random number. But here in the time code source, I can select it to show us the time code of the clip. And the clip in question is the adjustment layer. So if I go to the beginning of the clip, it's going to start at 0. And now as it plays down, it tells me what portion of the clip that I'm viewing. Now notice this time code does not match this time code. And you might ask yourself, why is that? Well, this time code is a sequence time code. The sequence time code is based on 23.976 frames per second. The clip, I'm going to do a backslash here, double click my adjustment clip. The clip is, if I go to my project window, the video info of this clip shows me it's 720 by 405. Oh, that's not the thing. Here's my jungle layer, 1920 by 1080. It does not have a frame rate. Notice. There's no frame rate associated with this clip. So this clip is running at a different frame rate. So the sequence is 23.97 frames per second. But if I look at my time display here, I've got 60 frames per second non-drop, which is why these two numbers don't match. If I turned on 24 frames per second and I played this down, now the numbers are going to match from this time code to this time code. I can also display frames, and there's a frame count. This is useful when doing animation. But typically what you're going to want is a normal type of time code. So you can select frame rate of the sequence. Well, the frame rate of the time code can be different from the frame rate of the sequence, which is what we were just able to illustrate. Also, if you notice in the sequence, the time code starts at 1 hour. That's just a convention. It doesn't always have to be that way. And my time code starts at 00. If I wanted to change that, I would have to go to generate my own time code, and I could start the time code at 1 hour. And if I just do 3 periods, that's going to then display the time code starting at 1 hour, which is what the sequence time code does. And so if I play it down now, they should match. 1 hour, 2 seconds and 15 frames, they now match. I could obviously also change this to 02 hours. And now they no longer match in terms of the hour. Sometimes when introducing different reels, cameramen will give the reel a different time code start time. so that you can easily tell which reel you're looking at this way. All right, so that's a little bit about timecode, maybe a little bit too much, but I could go back to 0 as well, and this will display my timecode as well as the name of the clip in layer V1. Let's look at another filter. I'm going to load another filter called Lens Distortion. In my effects panel, get rid of time here and look for lens. And I'm going to double click on Lens Distortion. That loaded it into the adjustment layer. If I turn on my effects control, I now have Lens Distortion, which does nothing because I have turned all of, well, the default is set to 0. Now, if I start curving the lens distortion, you'll see that it actually starts to change the curvature of the picture. Now notice it's also curving the time code, and we can't see the clip names anymore. Well, that's because of the order of filters. If I put the lens distortion first, now the time code and the clip name remain unaffected. Now this lens distortion is useful, for example, if you're trying to compensate for, say, a GoPro camera that's been shot in, if I turn it off here, you can kind of see that this shot is zoomed in, but this first shot is very wide, and there's a little bit of distortion introduced by the wide angle here. So if I turn on my curvature, that's probably a little bit much, but I can compensate a little bit, say at -15, for the distortion of the wide angle lens and flatten out this shot a little bit more. Notice it's having trouble playing everything back. That's because in my sequence, I have this red line now. If I hit X, X is going to select my entire sequence. That's because X selects from in to out. It uses the adjustment layer to determine the length of the in to out selection because the V2 track is targeted. And now I can go to sequence render in to out. And that's going to render the entire sequence now because the sequence is marked from in to out. Now I'm going to cancel this because I want to show you another way to render this. If I go to my project lesson window and simply click on the sequence clip names here, and now go sequence render effects in to out, it's going to render all the effects in that sequence, sequence number 10. You could select several sequences and apply sequence render in to out, and it will render all the effects in that sequence. So now my sequence has been rendered. I can play it down, and it should play down smoothly, especially at half resolution. You can see the timecode display, you can see the clip name display. Everything seems to play down nicely. Now let's say I apply one more effect to this monkey clip, and I'm not going to apply it to the adjustment layer. I want to apply it specifically to the monkey clip. So I'm going to select the monkey clip in my effects panel. I'm going to turn off my search, and I'm going to look for likes to look for another color correction, and let's go get the preset that I had previously, which was the sepia tint, and I'm going to drop that onto the monkey clip. All right, so now I have this preset on the monkey clip. Now, of course, if I try to play this down, it is not even playing at all in real time. You see how it jumps around? So I can put this at half resolution and see if it plays back any better. I still have jittery motion. I could go to view and turn off full quality, high quality playback. And it's still having a hard time playing this clip back. So I can decide that, well, I can't really see this clip. Also, it needs to be rendered. But let's just say this clip is giving me trouble. I can right-click on this and select Render and Replace. Now, what this is going to do is going to render this clip. Now, in the source, I'm going to select the individual clip, and here you can decide which type of codec you want to render it at. I'm going to set QuickTime, for example, and then I can select a preset, and let's just say Match Source Alpha ProRes, and I can select where I want this clip to be saved, and let's just say I'm going to save it to the desktop. Select folder, and you can even include handles. So if I do this, it rendered this clip and replaced it. Notice it also changed the name to rendered. And if I show this in the project, it's right under here. There's a visitor, there's the first clip, and here's the second clip that's been rendered at a different codec. Now, I might still have to render into out here. I select my V1 track and go render into out. Just render this particular clip. And if I play this back, now it plays back smoothly with the tint applied to it. So that is part of a workaround when sometimes your playback is being affected because there are a lot of effects applied to a clip. And in this case, my monkey clip has a color effect, a gamma correction, and a tint effect. And also it's being viewed through a adjustment layer that has a horizontal flip, a lens distortion, a clip name, and a time code effect applied to it. So there's a lot going on here. Notice, by the way, the name has been changed to MP3 rendered, MP4 rendered. And I need to move the position of that name so that I can see it. I'm going to put it up here. There we go. Notice you can also change the position of the time code. If I click on the time code effect, And I could drag the time code over to the left here if I needed to, for example. But now I need to re-render my clip. So you will find that you will quickly be in a position where you're not going to be able to play things back in real time when you start laying down a lot of effects and transitions. And so that's why there are all these workarounds. There's a workaround to diminish the playback that you're viewing your clip at. This seems to help a little bit if I put it at a quarter view. You can render and replace, which I did there, which allows me to play this clip back without rendering it, without rendering this part of the sequence. You see, I can now take a look at the real-time playback of this clip, even though my bar is red. That's because I did a render and replace from the source footage. But this is a bit misleading because I no longer have the original footage. You see, the original footage is the visitor clip. But I've replaced it with this rendered clip. So be aware of this when you're exporting. You're going to need to match back in to your original footage. The way to do that would be to select your original footage, click on it, drag it back down on top of this clip, but holding the Alt button with the snapping turned on. And now it's replaced the rendered clip with my original clip, Visitor MP4. So that's a good way to work with proxies, or to work with a rendered clip. In this case, my Visitor MP4 rendered clip allowed me to play back in real time. I rendered it so I could see all the effects, but I needed to relocate my original clip before deciding to export my final sequence. All right, so let's go to project lesson 12 and save it as, I'm going to save it as work in progress 2, because I had already saved one work in progress. You might be a work in progress 1. We made a lot of changes here. And I'm going to go ahead and close this project. We're now done with lesson number 12. And there are still many more effects and motion effects and color effects to look at. And we'll look at that in part 2 of lesson D. So that's the end of lesson D part 1. And we'll move on next to lesson D part 2.